Okay, so the first thing is last month somebody left this at the evening program, and if no one claims it, then I guess I have another water bottle. But I'll leave it up here. And then the other thing I need to talk about is December. We don't have a long feature program, and instead we're going to have a bunch of little like lightning talks or lightning slideshows. And I still need people to sign up for that. Like, you are the worker bees. I'm not doing everything. And Carol's not either. So, well, she is. But anyway, please email me soon. Publicity starts going out for this at the end of the month. And so I would like to know who's going to speak in December soon.
So it can be just one picture from your favorite flowers from the summer.
Yeah, or pictures of people or whatever. And we'll cobble them all together. Just, I guess nobody gets more than 12 minutes. Something like that. Larry?
Well, any of you have a project that you'd like to share with us? You know, the science-based thing.
Yeah, so
You've been doing that would certainly be appropriate.
yeah, if it's more research heavy, then, well, contact me either way. But the January meeting will be dedicated to students and recent graduates who are doing, something more than frolicking in the fields like me. Okay, so, well, without further, and either way, email me before the end of October. Okay, so without further ado, I'm going to introduce Marie Antoine, and she, I think she's kind of giving a autobiography, so I don't think I really have to say much more other than we love you.
Thank you, Paul.
You turn on that one and I turn off this one.
Okay.
Save better. Zoom people to see. I pressed it again.
You should be good.
I think you're okay.
All right.
Yeah, and the Zoom people will call me if anything doesn't work.
Okay. Well, thank you, everybody, for being here this evening. I know that everybody's super busy, so I extra appreciate you showing up. As I was organizing my thoughts for this, you saw my title on the first slide, but this other alternate title occurred to me, kind of getting to that age where I'm starting to ask these questions. Who am I? What have we done? Now what? Does it actually matter? So that's just my alternative title, but we have a three-part act tonight, and I will launch right into a very brief introduction. I always think it's really interesting to consider all the seemingly random little things that have to happen in order for you to end up in a certain place. So some of the key events in my life started with being here. I was born and raised on the north shore of Lake of the Woods, Ontario, Canada. Spent the first 19 years of my life there. It's a very beautiful lake with 14,600 islands. I highly recommend you visit if you haven't been there. I ended up on the West Coast though, and dabbled in some majors that didn't quite stick, like English and nutrition. If my father was still alive, he would say that I actually majored in rock climbing, but it turns out that that skill came in handy later for my actual career. The school topics that actually stuck were environmental science, followed shortly by a master's in botany, both at Oregon State University. For my master's, I studied nitrogen fixation by this particularly charismatic lichen, Liberia oregana. This is the lettuce lungwort. And this led me to the next kind of major transition in my life because I was just mopping up my master's degree, giving my first ever scientific talk, and I was so nervous I almost died. And I was just looking at this person in the front row who was nodding and smiling. I'm like, okay, I'll just focus on him. It turned out that it was Steve Sillett. Steve at this point was already a professor at Humboldt. He started here in 1996. In 2006, he became the Kenneth L. Fisher Chair in Redwood Forest Ecology. Ken Fisher is a Humboldt alumnus himself who became very successful in the economic field. And fortunately, he really loves redwoods. So last I heard, this is the only endowed chair position in the United States that's dedicated to a single tree species. But what this means is it's allowed Steve to choose his own adventure in terms of research topics. So I'm going to be going through some of that research tonight. But when I talk about our research and we and so forth, I'm talking about the research team that is led by Steve, which I've been a part of since 2001. So I met him at a scientific conference. We bonded over lichens. We hit it off real well. And we are about to celebrate our 23rd wedding anniversary in December. Okay, I didn't give up on the lichen thing, at least not right away. I taught in the biological sciences department for exactly 20 years, including 14 rounds of lichens and bryophytes, which was an extreme pleasure to teach that class, an upper division botany class that nobody actually had to take. I had some really fabulous students over the years, and it was my pleasure to do that for all those years. But I stopped doing that in 2023, and since then I've been focusing instead entirely on the redwood research and the tree research more generally. So even though I'm going to be focusing on the redwood research tonight, look, I threw some plant family names up there because botanists. We also, over the years, have studied redwoods' closest relatives, the Sierra redwoods, giant sequoias. We also have focused on some members of the pine family. Douglas fir, mostly up in Washington, but also here locally in the redwood forests, and Sitka spruce, primarily the ones here in the redwood forests where they grow incredibly tall in their competition with the redwoods. And then for many years, we also worked down in southeastern Australia and in Tasmania, studying the world's tallest flowering plant, the Eucalyptus regnans or the mountain ash. Unfortunately, our study forest burned in 2009, so it's been a while at this point, but it was also really interesting to go back and see how that forest responded to fire.
Hey Marie, hi, it's Andrea from Zoomland. Are you going through your slides? Because we're not seeing them progress.
Oh, lovely. Yep, I've been going through them. Any suggestions, anyone? Yeah, we're on slide number 11 right now.
Well, I think I would stop there. How about if you talk and I play with the slides?
Okay.
Do you need the slides to talk?
I'd prefer the slides to talk because they go along with what I'm saying.
Well.
Who was joking that people would be entertained if I stood up here and sang Yankee Doodle Dandy? Should I do that? My title slide says Insights from 2 Decades of Coast Redwood Research.
What's on your
Oh, this one here. That is, sorry, I got away from that light. That is the canopy view from about 100 meters looking out across Humboldt Redwood State Park. So the tallest forest in the world. It doesn't have the tallest individual tree, but it's the tallest average canopy height.
That the first one that you started on, can you go, that was not it, like the title.
The one that was up here when, that also was same forest, different canopy view, also Humboldt Redwoods.
I feel like it might have something.
I mean, we're
Okay, while Paul is figuring this out, which he will, we actually are on the slide where I wanted to pause for a moment anyway and say something that I think is important. And that is that over the past 20 years, I've been really fortunate to learn about redwoods from a scientific perspective, but I think we all know that there's different ways of knowing the world, right? So the people who are indigenous to the land throughout the range of redwood, that's 450 miles long and about 35 miles wide, those people certainly have a deep, a profound knowledge of redwoods and the forests they create. But that traditional ecological knowledge, that's not my story to tell, right? So I'm going to be focusing on what our team has learned from a scientific perspective over these past couple of decades. But I feel like it's important to make that distinction. How's it going, Paul?
Paul, are you on slideshow view?
Yeah, I'm trying to get rid of the presenter notes, which I
I don't have
has
any.
often been a problem. Yes, but it's still showing them like.
Sorry, guys.
Kind of putting me on the spot, though.
I can see a tab that says Start Slideshow. Is that a button you can?
Yes, I could do that, but, then we're back to.
Can you start from the current slide? Like, number 11 is where I interrupted to say that,
We would be happy to hear you start over again and look at the slides at the same time.
Are you guys seeing it? Are you guys seeing any, Dr. Waters, are you seeing any change?
No, no,
I think that's okay. What is that? Not sure what I read.
can you click on the View tab?
you would?
There's a tab at the top of the screen says View.
Yeah, you want to tell me what to do here? I'm clicking on the view. Yeah. Do you see anything? And then,
We're looking at slide 5 right now, lungwort.
Oh, good.
oh,
So
well, that
that
sort of seems
switched.
like progress. Normal, I would like to be normal, I guess. I mean, it sort of seems unlikely, but I don't know what else to try right now.
Ah, the blue screen of despair.
We're gonna sacrifice some eating too soon.
I can start that. And then start again. Oh, look, there's a whole bunch of us open. Interesting. How about if we try screen 2? Screen 2 might be what we're projecting. How about that?
Oh, that's full screen.
Okay, well, that's kind of nice. How about if I change
Beautiful.
slides?
Well, what does it say? What do they have?
Which slide are you on?
We're on slide, I think it was slide 5, Lobaria oregana.
That's it. Got it.
And we have full screen right now.
Yeah.
View.
Did that change?
Yeah, and there's Steve. Yeah.
There you go.
Okay, yay.
Hooray.
Woohoo.
Carry on.
I'll let you do something.
Okay. Okay, so I'm going to cruise through this because we already did that. I assume those were going out in Zoom land, right? We were progressing through the slides. Okay, well, so let's start with the what did we do and what did we learn? Well, the early research that I was part of was really kind of adventures in canopy exploration. If you can imagine figuring out the logistics of how to work 300 feet above the ground, just that in itself was a challenge. And I have to give a shout out to the Redwood National and State Parks for even letting us do this in the first place. That takes an incredible amount of trust on their part, really, to let folks climb and explore these trees all these years. So some of the things that were initially discovered, it wasn't that they were entirely new to science. It was just that these things were happening, like I said, literally hundreds of feet above the ground. So things like giant car-sized fern mats, the fact that you can have tree-sized trunks or reiterations sprouting off of transformed branches or limbs. These were some of the early things that just needed to be scientifically described. They had not really been done so before. This photo kind of cracks me up, Steve lurking in amidst the trunks there. Okay, another thing early on that we looked at was the epiphytes that were growing up in the tree. I should say that epiphytes, that word in general means organisms that grow on plants but don't parasitize them. So epiphytes are not actually hurting their host trees. They're just using it as a place to grow. One of the main players in terms of redwood canopy epiphytes is the leatherleaf fern, Polypodiaceae. And I'm going to return to this guy a little bit later on in a few minutes because it's one of the big take-home points that I'd like to make, the ecological role of this fern. But for now, let me just tell you that the soil built by these giant fern mats can hold like 1,500 gallons of water per tree. Imagine that water weight just up there, held hundreds of feet above the ground. You can probably imagine ecologically what that would do, right? It transforms what would otherwise be kind of a desiccating environment into a place that can support other forms of life, such as this little buddy, the wandering salamander, who we frequently, pretty commonly find up in these fern mats high above the ground. The other big player in terms of redwood epiphytes is the evergreen huckleberry, of course, an ericaceous shrub that everybody is used to seeing on the ground. It turns out that it likes it even more growing way up high in the redwood canopy because it's not competing for light up there. You often will have redwoods supporting these prolifically fruiting huckleberry shrubs, whereas the huckleberries on the forest floor beneath the trees don't have any berries on them. And another thing that I will return to a bit later is this word here, heartwood. It is redwood's heartwood that really makes this possible because it rots really slowly. It's these pockets, these juicy pockets of decay that ericaceous shrubs, and particularly the evergreen huckleberry, is able to exploit because of the nature of its mycorrhizae that can deal with waterlogged acidic substrates. So Polypodium schooleri, Vaccinium ovatum are the two big players in the redwood canopy. More on epiphytes in a moment. But if I'm taking you along on this journey of how one thing led to the next, documenting all of this biodiversity up in the canopy meant that we needed some way to say where it was actually growing. We couldn't just be like, there's a fern mat up in the tree, right? So being able to describe the structure of the tree itself was this process we kind of coined as tree mapping, for lack of a better term. But it literally was just quantifying in three-dimensional space where everything is up in the tree. There's Russell Kramer and Giacomo Renzullo looking like they're being very serious and professional in their tree mapping effort. Why would we do this? Well, we can say where on these architecturally correct tree models those structures actually occur and where the biodiversity is held, and this can get at some of the main functional traits of that canopy and of the trees that build the canopy. But it turns out that most of the predictive equations, if we wanted to take this to the physiological level, like how do the trees actually work, most of those predictive equations were designed for very simple, relatively small trees that you would have, say, in the forestry industry, a single trunk with branches. But if you have a trunk like this, that has not only a single trunk, but also an accessory trunk, these reiterated trunks down here, you can have individual redwoods that have hundreds of reiterated trunks. So you can imagine that the existing predictive equations weren't that effective for some of these super big, gnarly old trees. So that kind of led to the next thing, the need to somehow come up with predictive equations so that if people wanted to know how many leaves, how much wood, all that kind of stuff, they wouldn't have to climb the tree and map all that. Who's going to actually do that, right? Well, except for crazy tree climbing scientists. So that led to this whole effort of targeted branch removal. And no, we weren't going out and cutting down giant trees and dissecting them. We were taking a very small subset of the branches from those whole tree models that I showed you 2 slides ago, or maybe that was the last slide. Sorry, I'm a little rattled now. And removing some of those, taking them to the ground and dissecting them down to the individual needles on the tree, such that you could then develop equations to walk up to one of these giant gnarly trees and take a few fairly straightforward ground-based measurements and suddenly be able to predict things that have a lot of power in terms of understanding the physiology of these trees. So with those predictive equations developed through the dissection, we are able to say, take this tree that you might recognize from that, remember the National Geographic fold-out thingy? So that's that tree. There's Steve, there's me. We could walk up to that, measure its diameter above the buttress at the base, measure its crown spread, and measure its total height. And with some degree of accuracy, we can come up with its total biomass, just under 400 metric tons. We can say that there are over 1.4 billion leaves on that tree. So those predictive equations are actually quite powerful in understanding how these trees work, and also in being able to speak to their actual carbon fixation capacity and things like that. So predictive equations, yeah. But what about trees' performance over time? Well, to do that, that was kind of the next logical step. We got to start figuring out how the trees are storing their data in these tiny rings that they have. That requires extracting some of those tiny rings. Again, we're not going to cut the tree down to count its rings. So tree coring and dendrochronology, or the study of tree rings over time, allows us to answer those questions about tree performance over time. And I've got these oh so flattering pictures of Steve here to show this. Tree coring, you're basically using your arm power to drive a thin, hollow tube of metal into the tree trunk, and it removes a dowel of wood that's about the thickness of a drinking straw. So this isn't like a giant wound or anything. This is a very targeted little slice of tree rings that you pull out, and then imagine you're hanging, I don't know, 200 feet above the ground, and you've just pulled out a little crumbly straw of wood. Your next task is to put it on to this nice sawed piece of wood there so that it won't drop to the ground, and then you tape it on. It's a little stressful, but also very satisfying when you do get these tree rings, because then you can take it back to Allison Carroll. So Allison is the queen of redwood dendrochronology. She really is. Redwoods have been notoriously difficult to figure out the tree rings because at the ground level, they do all sorts of crazy stuff. They'll miss making a ring. They'll make a false ring. You have weird buttressing wood, all that kind of stuff. So before we started doing this, there was kind of this dogma that redwoods could not really be studied via dendrochronology. Allie figured it out. And part of the reason she did is because it turns out if you get up above that buttress at the base of the tree, you actually have nice even tree rings that you then can do some detective work and figure out what they mean. So Allie has, she's one of the most patient people I know. And the rest of the work that I'm going to describe here would really not have been possible without the work that Allie has done. So I want to make sure that I acknowledge that. Here's a close-up of some of her meticulous work. You can see here the bark with the sapwood. So most recent ring out here, getting further down into the heartwood here and back through time. This one, we actually got the pith, which is kind of cool because then you can actually directly count the age of the tree without having to model anything about how old it might be. The tree ring stuff, again, it's pretty powerful. You can start to ask a lot of questions, like this massively complex data slide, which I'm not going to go through all what this means, but if you blur your eyes and look at this, this is a measure of tree performance over time. You can probably intuitively tell that, right? This is actually by site. These are sites going from north to south for a range-wide analysis that we did a few years back. But with those tree rings and with the allometric equations where you can model the whole tree and how much wood it has, you can literally take the performance of the tree back through time and understand what it's doing in relation to various environmental factors. You can look at how it responds to fire, which is what all these symbols are, particularly in the southern sites. So the whole study of dendrochronology is super powerful. And in a species like redwood that can live for thousands of years, it's particularly meaningful to take those trees back through time. Okay, so if we can look at how trees respond in terms to environmental variables, that led us to the question, see how we're kind of marching towards something here? This led us to the question of, what about redwoods and climate change? It's kind of on a lot of people's minds these days, I would expect, I would hope. It turned out that this was a question that both Save the Redwoods League and, again, there's Ken Fisher. It turns out that was a question that they were interested in as well. So this was a big project that was started back in 2009, I think. And it had two main phases. Phases 1 and 2 were plot-based, and those were largely run by Dr. Bob Van Pelt. He's an affiliate professor up at University of Washington, and he is a master of quantification. So taking really complex structural data and putting it into visually appealing displays is kind of his specialty. So he has taken charge even now of going back to all of these plots and every year remeasuring them to look at what trees have fallen down, what trees have grown into the size class, stuff like that. I'm not going to dwell on that. Having Bob to give a talk here on that would be really interesting to you all, maybe. The tree-based study, the third phase of this project, is something I want to tell you a little bit about because it leads into some of the take-home points that I want to leave you with. RCCI 3, Redwoods and Climate Change, initiative, part 3, was tree-based, like I said. We had 45 sites spanning the entire range of redwoods. So from southern Oregon up in Curry County, all the way down through Monterey County. So spanning like 6 degrees of latitude. At each of those sites, we climbed and cored at least 4 trees. It was usually 5, sometimes 6 trees, for a total of 235 trees across that range. So this was super interesting because I felt like we really got to see all of the ways that redwood does redwood, if that makes sense. Like all the ways that a redwood forest can be, we got to know through this site, or through this study, excuse me. We locally here, we're all familiar with this kind of juicy rainforest phenomenon, right? This is up in Del Norte County. This is near the Damnation Creek Trail, actually one of the most beautiful redwood forests in my opinion. We all know that this northern edge of the redwood range is nice and juicy and foggy. Contrast that with the southern end of the range. Here's what that canopy looks like down on the Big Sur. You can see that the trees look a little different, right? And you can also see that up on these hills here, you lose the trees entirely. You get into more of chaparral vegetation type. Something that's interesting in these forests is anywhere, when you look out into the mountains, anywhere where you see redwood, it's where there's a little perennial creek. So those trees down there, those little stringers that are in those hills in the Big Sur, they need to have their feet in the water. Without going into too many data slides, particularly at this time of night, a couple of the big take-home points from this range-wide analysis have to do with things that you probably would expect. And that is that trees in the south of the range experience problems with drought earlier and more severely than trees in the north. So without beating this graph to death, on the left-hand side, we have our secondary forests. On the right, we have our primary forests. So this is like second growth and old growth here. The 3 different panels, the top panel is just growth efficiency. That's basically like for the units of leaves, how much wood is being produced. And you can see that the southern trees, in relation to the drought, so here's our years where the red is that multi-year drought. Remember when we were having to water our plants in January? You can see those southern trees started declining pretty fast and they never really got back to where they were. The northern trees, they hung in there in the secondary forests for at least the first couple of years of the drought. Then they took a dive. Kind of the same thing in the old growth forests. The southern trees right away, their growth efficiency started to decline and it didn't recover. It's a little worrisome for those southern redwoods. The northern and the central trees, they actually fared okay in the old growth forests. You didn't see that dip that you saw in the secondary forests. So the old growth forests look like they maybe have a little more drought resiliency than the second growth forests. I'm not going to go over how this was derived, but that SPEI is the standardized precipitation evapotranspiration index. It's a measure of drought that takes into account both temperature and precipitation. The steeper that is, the worse the drought. 2014, that was the height of the drought here. So that is just going along with what's in these other panels. This middle panel is your temperature. So again, with the x-axis having year on it, the y-axis is temperature here. We know that there's hot days and that hot days are not necessarily great for trees. But it turns out that the temperature parameter that might have more consequence to redwoods, at least in the short term, is steadily rising minimum temperatures. This is one phenomenon that was consistent across the entire range. It's not getting as cold at night. And there's an interesting kind of side effect of that. So you know that trees, obviously you know that trees make sugar through photosynthesis during the day, right? So assuming that there is enough time when the stomata are open and that they make their sugars, at night they should be able to use those sugars to build new tissue. But if it doesn't get below a certain temperature at night, if it's too warm, the drying power of air at night doesn't decline such that there's not enough turgor pressure in the layer of dividing cells to make new wood. So all that sugar that's made during the day has to go somewhere. It doesn't go to making new wood. It seems that it gets turned into heartwood fungicides. So there's this interesting phenomenon where in the southern redwood sites, we were finding that their wood, their heartwood, was highly enriched in fungicide, those red compounds that give redwood its name. So the more drought stressed the trees, the more of that fungicide they're making. I guess maybe that's kind of like a silver lining to climate change, but that slight upward marching of nighttime minimum temperatures seems to have this effect of less actual growth, but better wood in the wood that is made. Okay, so shifting gears here, sort of. That heartwood idea, that the heartwood could become more enriched with fungicide, that relates to carbon sequestration, right? The more of that fungicide, the more of those toxins that there are in the wood, the more decay resistant that wood is, the longer that carbon sequestration is going to occur. If you have wood that doesn't have any fungicide in it, as soon as it hits the ground, actually before it hits the ground, it's going to start being processed by fungi. So these non-timber values of tall sequoia, one of them is long-term carbon sequestration. We all know that redwood has excellent wood to start with, right? This is why they've been so heavily persecuted, because they make great decks, they make great hot tubs. Their wood does not rot. But there's also, with these non-timber values, the issue of biodiversity. So I want to get back to that one for a bit, and then we'll make a full circle and talk about both those at once, and then we'll be done. Okay, so along with climbing and coring the 235 trees, kind of as a side project, we kept track of the botanical diversity at these 45 sites. So I'll talk really fast while y'all digest all this. No, just kidding. This is just all the plant data. If anybody's ever interested in this, I'd be happy to talk with you about it. But the part of this that I really want to focus on is these upper two panels here, including this empty one. You might be wondering, why did she put an empty graph up there? It's because it's an important point. The other thing I want to say before moving on, though, from these lower graphs is there's a fair amount of diversity, 185 different species of vascular plants, and it's pretty high in the southern sites. So, oh, this is something I didn't mention yet. The latitude is up at the top here, where we start at the south and go to the north for both primary forests and for secondary forests. So south to north, south to north. If we look at all the species, you can see that they're not really clustered to the north and the south, except for your ericaceous shrubs, things like the huckleberries, the rhododendrons, the salal. Those are more of a northern phenomenon. But when you get into the southern sites down here, you start to get some really interesting ferns in particular. So it was a cool botanical exercise just to figure out what all these plants were at these various sites. I think our maximum diversity was in one of the Big Sur sites where we had like 35 different vascular plants. But the epiphytes. Okay, so of the 185 vascular plant species that we kept track of, only 19 of them made it into the forest canopy. And an important point is that there are no species of vascular plants that are unique to the forest canopy here in the redwoods. You'll sometimes hear these kind of breathless reports of there's these ecosystems unknown to science. They hadn't been described, but they are plants that are perfectly familiar to you. It's the same plants, they're just growing above the ground. So as far as I know, the only organisms that are unique in terms of plants or plant-like objects, there are a few microlichens that do seem to be exclusive to the redwood canopy. But in terms of the epiphytic vascular plants, they all occur terrestrially as well. Okay, so 19 species. Let's talk about some of these blanks in these graphs here, because this will bring me to my take-home points. Again, these are organized south to north. Let's just focus not on this blank for now, but on this blank right here. So these are the southern sites, everything south of about 38 degrees. In fact, we could say that everything south of about 40 degrees is pretty sparse with epiphytes, right? You see that? There's nothing there. Whereas here, we have the epiphytes in the canopy. These are Jedediah Smith, these are Prairie Creek. Yep. So yeah, just south of Eureka, the epiphytic vascular plants start to drop out. Can you make a guess why?
Fog drip.
You got it. CJ got it. Yeah. Redwoods like fog. They are stoked to have fog. A lot of plants in the redwood forest can take fog up through their leaves, including redwoods. Redwoods kind of get all the glory for that, but it turns out that Sitka spruce, sword ferns, they're all really good at foliar uptake. But redwoods, as long as they have their feet in the water, they actually don't need fog if they have ample groundwater. But epiphytes need the fog because by definition, epiphytes are not connected to the water source of their vascular plant host. They're not mistletoes, they're not parasites. So in order to get them through the summer dry season in our Mediterranean climate, they absolutely need the fog drip. So in places where there is not a certain minimum number of hours of fog, the epiphytes simply drop out of the canopy. I mean, not literally, they're not falling out of the canopy. Sorry, the epiphytes simply are not found in the canopy. So here's a truism. Redwood canopy biology is restricted by climate. You do not have car-sized fern mats or epiphytic shrub thickets when you get down into the southern redwoods. That's a feature of Humboldt and Dale North County. Okay, but what about this blank? So again, over here, these were our 32 primary forests or old growth redwood forest sites. These were our 9 secondary forest sites. No epiphytes, 0, except for a few lichens, but no vascular epiphytes, not one, not even in the juiciest rainforest environment. Well, young trees, they don't have the crown complexity. Remember I told you one of the very first things that our team found out was this direct link between structural diversity and biodiversity in the redwood canopy. So if you have a simple little tree like this with simple little branches, it's not going to support giant fern mats. It's not going to support the establishment of fern mats that could get giant. The way you get those reiterated trunks is to have damage. You can see here, this was an experiment that I haven't had time to go into where we actually did some experimental toppings of trees, including up in the community forest. Sure enough, they reiterated, but this takes 1,000 years, 1,500 years, 2,000 years. So those secondary forests that might be 150 years old at their oldest, they just can't do that yet. They're just babies. So here's another truism. Relatively few giant trees hold the bulk of canopy biodiversity if it's the right climate. Okay, well, we have a problem, right? Consider this. 95% of redwood forests have been logged at least once. Okay, whoops. Excuse me. That brings me to the last in my 3-part act. So now what? Here are 3 strategies that I would like to discuss with you real quick. First is to recognize and protect elder trees. So what do I mean by an elder tree beyond what you can probably guess intuitively? I think the real question here to start with would be, how can trees live to be 2,000 years old? How can redwoods do this? Well, it goes back to the heartwood thing. Redwoods live a long time because they invest in protecting their tissues from corruption, from fungal decay and from fire. Fungal decay of the heartwood is through those heartwood toxins that I was talking about, the fungicides. Protection from fire is the super fibrous bark, the outer bark of redwoods. This is how they can live so long. Some of the graphs that I could have regaled you with, instead I'm just showing you pictures, would show you that the bigger a tree gets, the more wood it makes. It has more leaves, right? If you have more leaves, you have more sugars being made. If you have a bigger trunk, you have a bigger substrate across which that new wood can be scaffolded on. So yeah, the bigger a tree gets, the more wood it makes. Turns out it does it a little less efficiently. So it needs more leaves to make the same volume of wood, but still the bigger a tree gets, the more wood it makes. And the bigger a tree gets, the higher the proportion of the wood that it makes is heartwood versus sapwood. So in terms of carbon sequestration, bigger trees are doing a better job. I already told you too that the bigger, gnarlier, more complex trees are the ones that host the biodiversity in the forests, right? If the climate's appropriate. So this combination of the champions of carbon sequestration and the champions of providing substrate for biodiversity are what we call elder trees. And I'm choosing this word very intentionally for two purposes, both literal and figurative. Literally, because of those 235 trees that I was telling you about for that range-wide thing, 34 of them had vascular epiphytes in them. The average age of those 34 trees was 1,300 years. So they are the elders in the forest. That takes a long time to have that structure. But I also like the word elder for its figurative sense in that you go across the world, pretty much every culture has respect your elders as one of its kind of beloved foundations, right? So elder trees are these special trees that are on the landscape providing outstanding carbon sequestration and biodiversity provisioning. Here's our next question, and this is something we are working on currently. How many of these trees are actually left? This is looking out across Arcata from the top of the Arcata Community Forest canopy, not an elder tree in sight there. You might be tempted to rely upon remote sensing. So we recently were doing a project where we were asked to help calibrate lasers from the space station. There's this project called JEDI. I don't know if you've heard about this, but it's an effort to quantify global carbon sequestration, basically. And the taller the forest, presumably, the more error there was associated with this. So our team was asked to help calibrate these space lasers. One of the ways that you can do this with is, with lasers that are shot a little bit closer to the Earth than space, lasers on an airplane, which is this LiDAR technology here. It's basically these fixed wing aircrafts that have lasers on the wings, and it's pulsating the surface of the forest with all of these lasers. The time that it takes for that light to be reflected back to sensors on the wings gives you a topographic map of the surface, if that sort of makes sense. So we were wondering, does this allow us to pick out places on the landscape where these special elder trees might be detectable? On this graph, the y-axis, this is these laser pulses estimated using our techniques of going out, finding the pulses that were shot from the space station and from the airplane, and then us going there physically and measuring it with our techniques from the ground. So here are our estimates of the biomass of those pulses. These are the estimates from lasers on an airplane. You can see it does a pretty good job. There's a pretty good correlation between what you get from flying out from an airplane versus actually going out and visiting all of these trees and measuring them from the ground. But you'll see the case with a lot of these high biomass trees, like the ones that are over 300 metric tons, where the lasers on an airplane are only getting about half of that predicted biomass. So the bigger the tree, the worse job remote sensing does. And that is because whether from space or from an airplane, it's only getting that upper surface, the topography of that upper surface. You're missing that giant trunk below, which is that giant cylinder of wood that's been slowly accumulating for thousands of years. So there's still a need for boots on the ground work if we want to figure out what's actually out there. But the lasers on an airplane were useful for showing us where you might look to figure out how many of these exceptional trees are left. Real quick, these are kind of funky to even look at. This is all of the park land where the colorful pixels is remaining old growth. The white areas are areas within park boundaries, but they've been logged at some point, so they're not old growth. The gray areas are the areas outside of the parks. If we were to string these all together, we're starting in the north. There's Jed Smith, RNP, Del Norte. This would be separated by the Klamath there and there. We go down to Prairie Creek here. There's Oric right there. All the way down, this is Humboldt Redwood State Park. There's headwaters, there's Grizzly Creek, and this is a close-up of where Bull Creek runs into the Eel River. These colors show us what the predicted biomass per hectare is based on the lasers on an airplane. This is sobering to me, and maybe only because I've stared at this a lot, but look at this. The highest biomass pulses, that's super rare. There's a lot of these kind of intermediate ones, but look at even a place like some of the finest remaining old growth in the world, Humboldt Redwood State Park. Most of that area is low biomass forest where you would not expect to find any of those exceptional giant trees. So this study of the space lasers and lasers on an airplane and all this kind of made us go, whoa, there's not even that many places left to look for these giant trees. And it turns out that every winter storm is a major attrition risk. As we've been doing this current research, we have come across so many of these trees on the ground, particularly after that 2023 snowstorm, ice storm. That was really tough on the old growth. Okay, almost done. So our current project is named Understanding Elder Redwoods. First objective is just to inventory these remaining elder trees. Turns out there's about 500 of them left. And this is not so we can publicize them and draw attention and bring people in to go gawk at them. That's not at all. This is so that we can help the park understand what that resource is. And also that we can kind of document them for posterity because, like I said, there's a huge attrition risk for these trees. The other thing that we're doing is documenting the full arc of life. So everything from kind of the prime expression of a giant redwood to where it's literally suffering structural collapse and falling apart. These are not done by climbing the trees. I'll tell you how they're done in just a sec. We also are climbing a very small subset, only about 12 of those 500 trees. And we're looking at basically the factors that are affecting how epiphyte communities develop. And then we're also doing some targeted coring to look at the fire history in the parks to see if we can figure anything out. And I got to give thanks, John Montague. The reason why we know that there's about 500 of these elder trees left is this guy, as his hobby, has been combing the woods. He's very low impact for the past 15 years and just kind of measuring these giant trees and keeping track of them. And he's the one who kind of raised the alarm of, hey, there's not that many of these left. And we maybe should document them for posterity while we can and also understand how they develop. So his family has actually funded this project. I also got to give a shout out to Max Forrester, who some of you might know. He's a local photographer and also an intrepid woodsman. He does this a lot. Do any of you recognize this? Slime mold. Yes, this is the glorious dog vomit slime mold, which he is obsessed with. So anyway, we're not climbing most of these trees. We are scanning them from the ground, again with LiDAR, which is that laser that pulsates and returns the pulses, tells you how big the tree is. But it's pretty much like climbing and trunk wrapping a tree. You can pulsate the surface of the trunk, this trunk, and get this image, and then you can slice it at various heights, and it's like you've climbed it and taken tape wraps. And then you can do your other standard ground-based measurements, like taking the crown radius, taking the tree height. And because of all that previous work that I told you about, we can know exactly how big this tree is and say, okay, we got this one. Here it is, and how old it is and all that stuff. This has taken us to some very interesting sites in the woods. We're about 1 year of 3 years in this project. Here's a giant limb. We are not allowed, as per our permit, to show pictures of tree climbing in the parks at this point. So all those pictures of tree climbing that I showed previously, if they had a person in them, they were not in our local redwood parks. But I can show pictures that don't have people in them. He'd be about this big. That's a big limb. These trees are super rare on the landscape. So to bring this home, here's my concern. This is a pie graph showing all of the land area where Sequoia sempervirens, where redwood grows. There's about 8,900 square kilometers, and 2,400 of that is gone. It's lost. It's been lost to development, lost to agriculture. Where we're standing right now, there would have been redwoods right here, stuff like that. That is no longer forest, this big gray portion. These light green portions here, I'm going to return to in just a minute, because this is where we need to focus. Old growth forests, it's about 5%. of the redwood range. Look at this though, mature forests, mature redwood forests that were logged 100 years ago, but have not been logged again. They are way more rare than old growth. This is what's scary to me. We know the ecological significance of these elder trees. There is not a provision for making trees like that in the future with our current land management. So this land that is either at rotation age, so for redwood, 50 to 80 years typically, or that has already been cut a second or even third time, look at all this area here. What can we do differently here? Here's what we can do. We can designate potential elder trees, which conveniently spells pets. Everybody loves their pets, right? Love my pets. Basically, pets are a small subset of trees, even in a working forest, that are taken out of rotation. They are designated, whether you put a conservation easement on individual trees, I don't know what this looks like legally, but you take them out of the rotation. The biggest, the best expression of redwood on that particular site, even if it's only an 80-year-old site, take some of those trees out and let them live out their natural life. For a redwood, that can be 2,000 years, right? Why would we do this? Well, it goes back to those non-timber values. Carbon sequestration, all that fungicide-invested heartwood that's in here, biodiversity provisioning, that bus-sized fern mat and all the critters that are supported by that being there. If we want to have that sort of process going on the landscape outside of that tiny fragment that's left in the parks, those colored pixels on that park map that I showed you, designating pets is one way to do it. Fortunately, we have some landowners who have bought onto this idea. We have a project that I'm not going to show you any data from right now, partially because everybody's probably getting sick of hearing me talk, but also because it hasn't been published yet. Steve is in the process of writing it up. Cal Fire bought onto the pet idea, and they are allowing their land managers to designate pets in all of their state demonstration forests. So we worked at Jackson, which has been, maybe you've heard about the controversies down right there, right? With what Cal Fire has been doing. We've designated a bunch of pets on the Jackson land. Thank you, Cal Fire. And also at SoCal and Las Posadas state demonstration forests. Those trees, at least if we can trust what has been designated in terms of the paperwork, those trees that we've designated and that they will continue to designate at a certain number per acre will not be cut, even though these forests will continue to have some logging done in them. We also have a local pet project out at Van Eck Forest in Fieldbrook. Maybe some of you are familiar with that place out in the Fieldbrook Valley. That was some of the finest redwood growing country on the planet. This is looking out across the Fieldbrook Valley. There's not a tree in this view that's over about 130 years old. There's not a single fern. There's not a salamander. There's not a huckleberry shrub up in those trees. But thanks to Pacific Forest Trust, who is in charge of managing that land, particularly Laurie Wayburn, who has embraced the pet ideas, there will be in the future trees that are allowed to develop those characters to allow them to become elder trees in the future. And I also need to mention Giacomo Renzullo here. You got to see him earlier. Remember the guys happily measuring ferns up in the tree way at the beginning? Giacomo was one of them. He has the greenest thumb of pretty much anyone I know, and he has been in charge of growing ferns. So we got a permit from the parks to go in after winter storms, after some of those losses of the elder trees where the fern mats hit the ground and explode, and collect a few of those ferns from the ground. Giacomo takes them to his house. He nurtures them for about a year until they are ready for this, being transplanted up into these pets. Again, the pets will never be cut. And we've learned some important things with this transplant experiment. It's been going on for 3 years now. We learned that if you simply use your hemp twine to tie a fern mat onto a branch, guess what happens when the hemp twine rots? Yeah, the fern mat slithers off the branch and falls to the ground. We were hoping, because leatherleaf fern, Polypodium schooleri, has those kind of finger-like rhizomes, we were hoping that within the course of the year that it takes for the hemp twine to rot, that the rhizomes would kind of go, no, they don't. But we picked up the ferns on the ground when we went back to do our remeasure, and we found the very little structure that exists in these young trees. It's few and far between, but this crotch between the two reiterated trunks is a perfect place to wedge a fern mat. It will not fall. That fern mat has now been growing there for 2 years. And I don't know if you can see this, but look, it's reproductive. It's got sori. So now that arboreal fern is spreading its little spores out across that landscape once again. Okay, finally, we are hoping, we've been talking with Arcata Community Forests, and they're totally open to the idea of pets, which is awesome. We've been talking about getting this going in our local forests, because you all know this is still a working forest that we have up here. They do log up there occasionally, selective logging. So it's about as visually and as ecologically friendly as you can get. However, if the biggest trees, the nicest trees are always up for grabs in terms of logging, we go back to that issue of not provisioning for elder trees of the future. So I love that Arcata is open to the idea of designating just a couple trees per acre even as trees that will be left in perpetuity. Next time you go hiking in the community forest, look for pets. So they're not trees that are necessarily bigger in the trunk. I purposely chose 2 trees here that have the same trunk diameter, but look up. Some trees, for whatever reason, have big, fat branches, even though they're the same age, both of those trees. This tree has a zillion tiny, skinny branches. Most of them will self-thin. This tree is the one that we would designate as a pet. It's already kind of dominating its space. Let's let it continue to do so. There are also a few trees in the Arcata Community Forest, I'm sure you've noticed some of them, that they're not regrowing from the logging. They were already there. They weren't taken 120 years ago or whenever that particular site was logged. They were tiny trees at the time. Maybe they had defects, so they weren't chosen for logging. These are ones where we can now focus on these fern transplants. Here's a tree same tree. You look up, if you see something up against the sky that's blocking light, that tells you there's something cool up in that canopy, right? Or up in that crown, excuse me. So this close up is this. Look at all that structure. There might already be ferns up there. We can't tell from the ground. We were looking with binos, but we know that these super important leatherleaf ferns naturally grow here. They're all over the ground, right? They probably, a lot of these mats that are still here fell out when the forest was being logged. Let's just put some of them back up where they can help rebuild that canopy biodiversity. Next time you go walking in the community forest, look for these big fern mats. There's lots of them. So I will leave you with this thought. Forests of the future depend on what we do now. It'd be kind of cool if Arcata Community Forest looked like this in 1,000 years, right? All right, thanks. Okay. Again, I apologize for the rough start. If we have time, I'm happy to take questions, but I also know that people are probably ready to go home. Question.
I've noticed in the community forest, there's lots of epiphytes and trees that have been logged. I say at the 10-foot level where there's different tops.
Yeah.
So current logging practice probably just goes to the ground. When they're logging occurs, is there any like plans to log some trees at a 10-foot level to create that map?
A lot. You're probably referring to a lot of those same fern mats. Oh, the question, Ron, right? What Ron said is if you walk around in the community forest, you'll see a lot of those old stumps. They cut them high, right? They have the springboard notches in them because back in the day, they wanted to get above the flare at the base of the tree. That provides kind of the perfect place for epiphyte establishment in 2 ways. The first is a lot of those ferns. Imagine when that old forest was being cut, there were probably giant fern mats raining to the ground everywhere, right? Probably kind of dangerous actually. But those that landed on top of those 10-foot stumps, they have a competitive advantage because they're above the fray of the forest floor. The other thing that those stumps provide, the reason why you see epiphytes on them, like Ron said, is huckleberries. I mentioned they're mycorrhizae that are able to persist in the rotting acidic wood of rotting redwood heartwood. So those old rotting stumps are actually perfect for huckleberries because it's like a big pot of rotting soil for them. I would say in terms of that being a logging practice for fostering epiphyte diversity, why not just leave the whole tree versus a 10-foot stump?
I had to smile when you said that the trees were being persecuted because I read Ghost Forest this summer. I wonder what you thought of that book.
I haven't read it.
Oh, okay.
No, I know about it, but I have not yet read it.
Okay.
But yeah, I do. I mean, I know that the stronger argument in that book was that the trees were indeed being persecuted and that people should have done more to save more of them, right? Is that
Yeah.
kind of a good take home? You know, it's hard to look back at what was going on 100 years ago and judge people by today's standards, because at that time, I feel like people would have been like, oh, this is inexhaustible. Let's just take what we can. Of course, then you add in human greed and the fact that people were making so much money on that. Do I think that more of the redwood forest should have been saved back then? That would have been really nice, but that's not how it happened. So I think at this point, pointing fingers, and one of the reasons I haven't read that book is I don't really like some of the acrimony that I've heard in terms of the tone.
Looking forward.
Yeah, I think we need to look forward, not backward, because we can't change that. And, you know, the whole blaming Save the Redwoods League, for example, for things they might have done differently. We got to thank Save the Redwoods League for the bits that we have left, not say you should have done something different. It's just my opinion.
Hi.
Hi.
That's a really stupid question, but I love this idea of pet trees. And but I'm curious too about like, if they log around all around the pet tree and a major storm comes through, is that pet tree gonna be able to withstand the storm? Because don't they need their buddies to kind of hold them out?
Okay, so the question is, what happens if you say you log all the trees and you leave just one pet? That would be a poor, sad, vulnerable tree. I absolutely agree. I'm suggesting not necessarily that we leave just one tree surrounded by a clear cut. What I would love to see happen is to designate at least a few pets per acre, and then also consider what logging methods we might use on that surrounding land that is still fair game for taking trees out. There's a lot of selection logging techniques that would not be a clear cut, leaving that tree vulnerable to wind throw. So that's absolutely a concern. Yeah. That would be awesome. I want to figure out how to make pet trees happen, how to make pets happen. We shouldn't say pet trees though, right? Because potential elder tree. So we can just call them pets. Yay.
So does the introduction of epiphytes speed up the production of the elder trees?
That's a really good, so the question was, does the introduction of epiphytes speed up the development of elder trees? It certainly speeds up the development of canopy biodiversity. And this is something I should have mentioned when I was saying why epiphytes require fog. If you wanted to start that leatherleaf fern from a spore, you need a nice moist little nook for the spore to germinate into this fragile little free-living gametophyte. It's like this little one-cell thick layer of tissue where the sperm has to swim to the egg to fertilize to get a zygote that then finally will grow into a sporophyte that resembles a fern frond. Okay, you could have that. Or you could take a loaf of fern, shove it into a nook up there, and you have a fern mat. So yes, it speeds up the development, absolutely. I wouldn't say it speeds up the development of the pets themselves, like it doesn't promote the tree growth or anything, but in terms of canopy biodiversity, absolutely. Yep.
Some of the first slides you showed you and Steve climbing up ropes on very large diameter trees. And the rope appears to come from the very top of the tree. Who placed that rope up there? How did they do it?
That would be my husband. So the question is, when you saw some of those photos where we are climbing and the rope disappears into the sky, yeah, you got to get the rope up there somehow. To make a short story of it, that rigging step is absolutely the most dangerous part of the whole process. That is something that Steve and a handful of his students and colleagues have done over the years. I don't do the tree rigging. I have the privilege of climbing up ropes that have already been fixed at the top. But the way that it's done is there's no spur climbing. We don't stick anything into the tree. It's using basically a bow and arrow. So using the bow to shoot a rubber tipped arrow that's trailing fishing line up through the crown of the tree. That's strong enough to pull a parachute cord back up, and then that's strong enough to pull a climbing rope up. But then Steve or whoever's rigging the tree has to climb up to where that shot went over and then rig the tree to the top using arborist techniques, basically, while trailing the rope with him. So that's definitely the most involved part of the process. Once he gets to the top, he simply finds some nice, big, safe things to tie the rope around, such that there's 2 independent climbing paths that go to the ground. And then someone like me can just like climb up. Carol.
What you said about the forests of the future depend on what we do today. I guess I'd like to point out that the people who can really make this happen are called registered professional foresters. And, you know, we might think, oh, they're the bad guys, they cut down the trees. But no, it's the people who can tell the guys with the chainsaws which trees to cut down, and they're the ones who can change the forest.
Yes. Yeah, the more people, are there any forestry majors in the room? I see a few students.
Grad school.
Yes. Are you going to hopefully be an RPF someday?
I would love to, yeah.
Cool. Yeah, it's what Carol said is absolutely true. Like forestry gets a really bad rap, but on all of these lands that have been modified by forestry, only forestry can fix them, right? Humans created the problems. Humans need to help solve some of these problems. And registered professional foresters in California are the people who get to write the land management plans, basically.
So I think
Thank you all.
maybe we should stop the public questions, but Marie, maybe you'll
Oh.
stay for some one-on-one. And then also she brought lemons, and I
Oh.
think she's refusing to take any of them home. So if you would take them away, that would
Yep.
that would be nice. So please help me thank her.
Thank you all.